Alright, so this is meant to be a continuation of the, or rather a revamp of the Gloomhaven Grenadier Tinkerer build I posted, was it 2 years ago now? So it has 500 views because I guess other people haven't talked about this, maybe? I don't know. In any case, I'm sure I'm not the biggest brain person. But I made a video about the premise of using the Tinkerer as a full assault character, so I am going to be redoing this now that I have it in digital format. Going to be a lot easier and obviously crisper graphics than using my laptop camera. I'm basically going through it, so this is meant to not necessarily be pro build strategy or anything. It's just kind of me talking about the premise of running an assault build for the Tinkerer. So this is going to have Prosperity 9 spoilers. I have the character selected, so I'm going to try and stay away from the town records or any of the other class slots. So it should just be the Prosperity 9 spoilers for the merchant, as well as any side scenarios / retirement goals that we've gotten so far. Which, I mean, there's quite a few. We're at Prosperity 9, and most of that was from, retiring people. So yeah, so I will start basically by talking about level 1 and what options are available. I do also have the Gloomhaven item database repository or whatever it is, tool online, so it can kind of go through a level by level breakdown on what I take, but really the answer of what I take with the Tinkerer is pretty much the same throughout all levels. It's very very boring to equip for, I guess, in some senses, but on the plus side, it obviously makes it a lot easier to keep track of sort of what you need and what you need to keep an eye out for. So I'll be going through sort of the level 1 cards, what I take, and then from there just basically going through, as with most other guides, and just talking about the level by level basis. I'm not going to necessarily talk about all of the choices as far as decks, because there are going to be some scenarios where bringing a heal or bringing a move loss or bringing a loot loss are going to be more helpful just based off of the special scenario rolls, but just as an overview for sort of the direction I want to take the build. So we will start off with level 1 here. So to start with, as has been pointed out by other people, and I definitely clicked on it and already showed the other people. Great. It's fine, probably, unless you stop at the specific frame. The Tinkerer is, in essence, sort of a support character, or at least that's how a lot of people play it to begin with. But you do have quite a few loss attacks, which are pretty spicy, so you can use a 6 damage trap, which will go through shield, notably, which is even useful against high-level enemies, because you can run into elite flame demons with 6 shield and 6 health, and this theoretically would kill them if you get rid of their flying. Likewise, any other high shield enemies just take the damage directly, which is pretty convenient. You have a few loss attacks, interestingly enough, notably enough. One is a melee, and then most of the other ones are ranged, so Ink Bomb, Net Shooter, and then Toxic Bolt's bottom, although this is obviously not multi-target. So to begin with, I mean, you have quite a variety of items here, of course. I don't find Restorer of Mist useful, nor do I generally bring Proximity Mine, just because while it is a loss for 6 damage, it's single target, whereas most of these other ones are multi-target and can do a little bit more useful bottom actions, as opposed to just a move 4, since we already have a few of those. And you do also have the ability to, of course, have CC effects on these, which I find a little bit more interesting. So I would generally say Reviving Shocks is a pretty good card from the get-go. I believe Gripeway in their build guide online talks about it quite a bit as well. Basically, this is one of your few non-loss multi-targets, regardless of level, so very convenient to keep that on hand. Likewise, you can kind of fret around with different options here. I'm personally a fan of sustaining teammates rather than healing, so while I wouldn't bring Potent Potables, which is very strong for a healing build, I might bring Volatile Concoction just for the bottom. If I have a burn bottom movement, or sorry, a wasted bottom movement where I'm not doing anything important, being able to give people back their cards is very useful, especially if you end up having ice in the air. It basically gives people a free turn. Likewise, you can just bring Proximity Mine just for the bottom move, or for the ability to slam and jam something, block off AI paths, etc., etc. But I don't generally bring Restorative Mist or Energizing Tonic or Potent Potables as a level 1. So yeah, pretty straightforward. So to level up, look, you only have a couple of options here, very obviously, to begin with, and depending on how you look at it, it's kind of a no-brainer. If we're focusing on dealing CC and damaging enemies, Stamina Booster does absolutely nothing for us, whereas Disorienting Flash, while a lost top, does give us the ability to multi-target stun, which is pretty convenient. And then we do also have a CC bottom. So that being said, when I generally level up the Tinkerer, I generally do go for Stamina Booster, the reason being because having a ally recover a burn card is extremely helpful. Having a top heal isn't exactly ideal, but it's cool for those scenarios where you start wounded, or you know, if characters have suffered damage, something like that. Just being able to do that as a first action, or even when you're moving in between rooms, just being able to top people off. But I basically just bring this card for the bottom. I pretty much burn it away almost immediately. Likewise, I use Reinvigorating Elixir a lot because it basically gives people a free long rest on the bottom, and having another top heal isn't too bad. But for the purposes of us focusing on being a full assault build, I would be going with Disorienting Flash in this case. So to that end, probably the easiest one to get rid of would be Volatile Concoction, because again, it's a sustained bottom, and the top trap is not particularly useful. You could decide to get rid of Reinvigorating Elixir instead if you want to have more personal sustain where you have less burn cards that you're using. But again, having a top heal is situationally useful, and this is just a free long rest for people. You know, it gives them however whatever the math on cards is for people not losing cards. I believe it's another like 2 turns at least, potentially more. So quite useful in that regard. I totally forgot to talk about items. That's fine. We'll get to those later. For level 3, we have a couple of choices here. Almost making you wish maybe that we had Tinkerer's Tools available as a level 2 card. Interesting synergy, not that people use this or I'm suggesting it or anything, but if you do decide to use Tinkerer's Tools, with the bottom stun trap, of course it doesn't do any damage and it's good for routing monster AI. With a relatively fast initiative, you can actually use the bottom of Tinkerer's Tools to make a stun trap in an adjacent empty hex, and then use Hook Gun to pull an enemy into it. So as long as they don't have flying, as long as they're within range 3, as long as they don't move before you, or if they do move before you and they're still within range 3, whatever, that basically just gives you a free stun. So because we already have stun shot, being able to use Tinkerer's Tools, Hook Gun, and then Stun Shot the next round on an even earlier initiative is basically 2 rounds of stunning stuff. If you end up doing something spicy like adding Wound to Stun Shot, you know, all the better. And in any case, because we're looking at running a build that's focused on dealing damage more so than CC, Crankbow is extremely spicy for us. While it is a loss, it's an attack 6, you can enhance it up to 8. Has crazy range, and it has a nice move 4 bottom, so it's sort of an obvious choice. We'll talk about items later, and that will sort of, you know, also get around with why there's some specific items that make Crankbow pretty great for us. So I'd probably recommend getting rid of Proximity Mine at this point, just because it is, again, another loss one for about 6 damage. You know, it's similar initiatives, exact same bottom. So it's kind of a no-brainer in that regards. I also definitely forgot about Harmless Contraption being a card, so that would also be a really easy one to get rid of pretty early. You do have the ability to use it as a decoy just to, you know, suck up damage or use the bottom as a heal. But generally speaking, I find that unless you're doing double heal actions or unless you're not moving, you don't really have a use for a bottom heal. And having a meat shield is just generally not as useful as stunning or dealing damage. So probably would look more like this at this point, once again, if we're going full into damage and CC. So for the next level, we have a theoretically quite interesting one for our build, that being the BattleBot. So it's a 6 health to damage summon. So it is a straight upgrade from the decoy insofar as it actually deals damage. It is a slower initiative, but it has an identical bottom otherwise, so in a lot of regards, a upgrade of a card. That being said, personally, I don't generally muck with summons unless it's a summon dedicated build, and I don't feel like the Tinkerer is one, so I generally skip that. You know, to each their own, but I just personally find that it's not terribly useful. Likewise, it's only dealing 2 damage, and unless you're bringing a lot of healing, you're not really going to keep it alive for long, especially with it having only 6 health at level 4, so that's like maybe 2 hits. Likewise, Microbots is a move loot bottom, so while useful for some scenarios where we have to loot things, or the top for, you know, doing a mass heal, I mean, it's not, the top isn't really that much better than our energizing tonic, which is a loss from level 1, and it's like a slower initiative. So I likewise, just like how I didn't select energizing tonic, I'm not going to select Microbots. So in this case, it is actually the sort of thing where you can actually go back and potentially grab one of the other level 2 or 3 cards. So personally, again, I'm a fan of Tinker's Tools just for being able to stun things. So in this case, if you're looking for a card to replace it with, I think Proximity Mine this time for realsies would probably be the good one to get rid of, just because of the additional ability of disarming traps, which in some scenarios, especially at higher levels, is kind of a bigger deal. That being said, this is certainly more of a situational card. If you end up not using Hook Gun or deciding to get rid of it, etc., then you can likewise get rid of Tinker's Tools quite quickly and easily. For our next level up, have another couple of interesting options. So depending on how you look at this, it's again a no-brainer or a very difficult one. So Noxious Vials, of course, has a bottom loss multi-target attack, which is kind of the entire flavor of this build while we're running Flamethrower, Ink Bomb, and Net Shooter. Noxious Vials lets us do that again, but as a bottom, which not only, you know, allows us to use 2 losses in 1 turn if we really want to be very lossy about it, but you do also have the ability to poison enemies with the bottom and then use a top attack. That being said, unless you're using Net Shooter, you're probably not acting on initiative fast enough to use 2 loss, since the Ink Bomb and Flamethrower cards are significantly lower speed, and even if you use Crank Bow, likewise. Your other option is Disintegration Beam. So while I don't suspect this is going to be a extremely beginner friendly build per se, or guide overall that people are going to be checking out, it is worth noting, if you've never considered it before, that Disintegration Beam, at least in the tabletop version, presuming we haven't been playing it horribly wrong, which is possible, applies to enemies that also only have 5 health to begin with. So by default it says, if something has 5 health or less, then you can kill it. But for instance, Wind Demons, Flame Demons sometimes, quite frequently, only have 5, 4, 3, 2 health. And in that case, this still kills them. So you can basically look at it as a multi-execute loss, or a multi-target execute loss execute, against the high shield, low health enemies. Likewise, Vermling, Shamans, or Forest Imps are also candidates for this, although the elites end up generally having more health than this applies to. And the bottom is also another move and then CC with Disarm, which is kind of convenient. So in this case, it's kind of a no-brainer to me personally to use Disintegration Beam over Noxious Vials. Again, your mileage may vary. I feel like this is a lot more useful. That being said, it's going to be situation dependent. If you're not fighting enemies with a lot of shield and low max health, then obviously it will be a lot less useful than Noxious Vials. That being said, still being able to execute 3 up to 4 enemies with 5 health or less is pretty neato. So that's 15 to 20 damage if you do end up enhancing it. And getting enemies in that sort of formation shouldn't be too hard for us, due to the ability to, of course, use trap cards, as well as the existence of, well, gun primarily. So in this case, choose Disintegration Beam. Depending on what stage you're at in the game, you kind of have a few choices to make. Stun Shot, if you're not going for CC or need large bottom moves or want repeatable stun, is kind of one of the candidates I'd consider for the ability to bring Disintegration Beam. That being said, of course, CC is a useful alternative to dealing damage, but as we build this deck more towards dealing damage, then, we don't really have as much room for CC. Likewise, Enhancement Field could be one, primarily because a +1 attack when you start getting into level 5 is just not as convenient, I believe, at this point, depending on if you are actually speed retiring characters or not. But in any case, if you're at Prosperity, like Wealth 5, but I believe you should have the major power potion, so people should be able to grab their +2 damage on attack anyway. That being said, the attack 3 top being repeatable is obviously quite convenient. Likewise, if we want to, again, lean away from a sustain build, we can look at getting rid of Reinvigorating Elixir. So it sort of depends. At this point, I think most people will have enough stamina potions that we're okay getting rid of Reinvigorating Elixir, especially because with the disparity of card count and items and gold, etc., you'll likely not be resting around the same time as teammates as much unless you explicitly plan it, and a heal 3 just kind of falls away by this point. So in my case, I think Reinvigorating Elixir is probably the best for kind of focusing on a full damage build. So looking at level 6, have a couple more interesting choices. So we have Gascaster, which is another trap card, which again, like I said, I've been primarily staying away from with this build. That being said, you do have the benefit of it being a repeatable 4 damage one, so again, it can just chew right through shield/ignore it. So if you have enemies such as like golems, for instance, they're especially hurt by traps, considering how they only generally move like 1 or 2 movements, unless you're playing it plus difficulties. Likewise, the bottom is another sustain build for our friendlies, which I'm sure they're always appreciative of. Although it is a loss for discard cards, it only gives 4. So if you have a friend like a Spellweaver who is absolutely spamming like 3 cards, this might be very of interest to them, most notably with their Cold Fire card. But objectively speaking, if we don't need to recover 1 card, or if we don't need 1 ally to recover 1 card for 4 turns, then it's a burn for 4 card recovery, whereas we had a burn for as many cards as they have in their hand recovery. So recovering 12 cards in 1 round is, in my opinion, a lot more useful than recovering, 4 over 4 rounds. So that, with the low initiative and the fact that the top is again sort of situational, kind of, doesn't make me too terribly interested in it. That being said, if it was like, say, a 4 damage immobilize or disarm or something, maybe see a little bit more use, but not for me in any case. So auto turret is kind of another weird one. So just like gas canister, it is doing an effect over multiple turns. In this case, it is a, well, I mean, you can read it's you deal 10 damage in theory over 5 turns. That being said, with it being an attack 2, if you're attacking anybody with shield and you don't have pierce, you're basically dealing 0 damage. I believe, I've read up on this a couple of times. I honestly don't quite remember. I believe that you have to burn the, or rather advance the counter, even if you can't perform the attack. Could be wrong about that. I don't use this card, so it's a non-issue. But that might be something to consider, something to look up, or something to perhaps make an alternate build in Guildmaster and try and make sure that auto turret performs as you expect, because if you do expect it to only do 5 attacks or do attacks when enemies are within range, then if it doesn't, you're hooped, and if it does, then it actually makes this card a little bit more viable. We have a bottom heal, but again, not really our job at this point, especially if you've been kind of going in line with this build, which is being super aggressive. So we can actually go back and pick up Noxious Vials. Again, whether or not you actually want to, your choice. I just love the multi-target losses, so I will definitely continue bringing those where applicable, and having a little bit more sustain for our friendlies is fine, I guess. Refreshing a consume small item is pretty good because you can give people another attack 2 to their entire attack action. You can give them 2 cards back due to refreshing a major stamina potion, or there's a whole bunch of other things that you could refresh if you have merchant items, random item designs or retirement things, and it can get kind of crazy depending on what you refresh, especially as a non-loss. So again, we'll get to that, but in any case, Noxious Vials is definitely a card we're going to want to bring. So at this point, it's going to be a question of sort of what you're willing to lose. You can look at losing some CC, you can look at losing some repeatable attacks, some multi-attacks, maybe some of the other prior cards, which we're again looking at CC or utility. Personally, again, I'm a simp for Hook Gun. I love it. I love being able to pull enemies into different formations. I love being able to sort of control the battlefield. So Tinkerer and Cragheart are both very high, in my opinion, for characters that I not only enjoy playing, but I find effective. That being said, of course, we're only just playing on normal difficulty, so your mileage may vary. But personally, I feel like at this point you can kind of look at getting rid of Reviving Shocks, because the bottom is a loss heal that we aren't really using, or at least I'm not personally using very much, other than maybe if we're in the last couple of turns, I'm just burning it for EXP. And again, the top is sort of shunted off by most shields. And again, the purpose of this build is sort of to be multi-target loss, high damage attacks rather than like chipping away at people. So that's probably the most obvious one to get rid of in my opinion, presuming you're running an identical deck up to this point. That being said, of course, Disorienting Flash, being a loss stun, or potentially Tinkerer's Tools are also sort of available on the chopping block. That being said, I'm going to try and refrain from, getting rid of prior level up cards where reasonable. And likewise, again, on a scenario by scenario basis, depending on what you're fighting, who you're with, if you have to replay a scenario, etc., you might run into situations where you go back and pick up other things like Proximity Mine anyway. So for level 7, we have Killbot and we have Curative Aerosol. So I'm not even really going to talk about this much because you can just look at the cards. Yeah, we're going to go with Murderous Contraption. So there's not really a whole lot to say about it, other than murder is very much in line with our interest. That being said, I do want to note, whilst the top is, yes, a straight upgrade from the Dangerous Contraption of earlier, the bottom is what's spicy. I love bottom attacks. I bring them and use them as much as applicable because I was trying to get into situations where I can have a useful top and bottom attack, and if our useful top and bottom action, and if both of our actions are ranged attacks, then presuming there's enemies left in the room, you basically guarantee you're going to be able to use them. Worst case scenario, you move to, you can recover it. So it's just a super good choice as a bottom action primarily. I think I've only summoned it maybe a half dozen times for the top, and that is again primarily for EXP near the end of the scenario. It's not really useful in my eyes as a 3 damage melee attacker with only 6 health. But again, if you need meat shield or if you need somebody to run through traps, I guess you could use it for that as well. So for guys to get rid of at this point, we are looking a little lean for our level 1 cards now. That being said, you may or may not have different opinions from me on which to keep, or again, what to have even brought up to this point. Personally, I looked at keeping Flamethrower, Hook Gun, Ink Bomb, Net Shooter, and Toxic Bolt as absolutely long as possible, because the bottom of Toxic Bolt is a attack 5. Net Shooter and Ink Bomb are our loss top actions that can deal a lot of damage. Flamethrower is another one that can absolutely chew through enemies with shield. You can see it has quite a few enhancement pips for being able to do even more spicy bullshit with it. And again, Hook Gun, pulling people around, pulling them into traps. Map control is extremely useful in my eyes. So at this point, you can kind of look at, okay, maybe we do have to look at getting rid of one of the other repeatable attacks, or looking at getting rid of one of our level 2 or 3 cards. So you have a few options. Enhancement Field is probably the easiest one at this point. If you have enough repeatable damage, or if you feel like you have enough repeatable damage, or if your party has enough repeatable damage to get rid of it at this point, because again, the bottom is kind of falling off. Alternatively, Stun Shot, again, it's just CC, or even Disorienting Flash, which is a multi-CC. Again, this was primarily picked because the other level 2 option wasn't exactly super assault-y. So being able to get rid of it now that we have quite a few other CC tools in our belt, especially because of its low initiative, its lost nature on the top, and its low move on the bottom, especially with its requirement with, being in melee range in order to target all adjacent enemies, is probably the one I'm going to get rid of. So look at leveling up again. Boom, 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 boom. All right, so we've got another couple of interesting things in premise. Jet Propulsion is super crazy if you are running summons. We are not. Bottom move is potentially super spicy for being able to, well, especially with the jump as a loss, being able to yeet ourselves to the end of the map. Depending on the situation, again, but super situational, so you could go back and grab it maybe if you really wanted to. Harsh Stimulants is very interesting. Insofar as I think it's one of the few cards where it's a trade-off. You take damage to deal damage. There are a couple of other cards and builds that have that as more core mechanics to the build, but this is, I think, the only one that I can think of in the in the starting 6. I could be wrong about that. There is like an asterisk one where it does it, but it doesn't affect yourself, which is Inferno for Spellweaver. But in any case, very cool because, again, of a couple of items available. If you didn't want to bring Harsh Stimulants, which is what I'm going to be doing, you could look at bringing some of the more situational cards. Maybe you want to go for Auto Turret for the attack over time, for being able to just burst higher, although a loss action for attack 10 is not as cool as a loss action for attack 9, with the caveat of, because we can do more than just attack 9 with it, where I don't really think you can boost Auto Turret unless you're using maybe Enhancement Field's Bottom for increasing your damage over a turn. Maybe Harsh Stimulant would apply to it, but actually it doesn't apply to yourself, so never mind on that. Yeah, maybe you want to go back and grab Dangerous Contraption to have a chump shield. Maybe you want Stamina Booster for recovering, a burn card. In any case, Harsh Stimulants was a easy choice for me, again, for a level 8 card, because of the nature of us doing a bunch of damage. Now, when I first made the guide, I believe I was at like Prosperity 5 or 6, so there has been a change in items that I have been made aware of, and thus Harsh Stimulants being a melee for a top action kind of changes what my build plan was. And I know that's super kind of vague and nondescript, but again, when we get to items, it'll make a lot more sense, I promise. Bottom is super interesting if you're not running a summon build, because you don't really want to kill half of the summons in the game due to dealing damage to them, especially doing multiple. That being said, if you have friendlies who are tanky and or people who are going full out on damage this round, being able to suffer 2 damage to add +2 attack to any attack, and generally speaking, if you're going quote-unquote all out on attacks, you're doing a lot of them or you're targeting a lot of people, being able to add +2 attack is kind of crazy. That being said, it is a bottom action, where the top action as a melee attack on our otherwise extremely ranged build is not super useful, so I'm just going to leave it unselected, with the mention that I'll come back and talk about it later when we talk about items. But otherwise, you could look at getting rid of something else that's a little bit more melee-y, cough, flamethrower, or maybe you want to be more melee-y, in which case this is not really the class for you in general. Anyway, so level 9, last level. This is where things get kind of crazy. So, once again, presuming people probably have a decent grasp on the game up till now, which means that this video is probably about 20 minutes longer than it needs to be, but in any case, Chimeric Formula has been changed, the bottom of it, that is, from the board game, because in the board game, it's one adjacent ally may recover a card, a burned card from anybody else within range 3, or something along those lines. Or something about being beside them or whatever. But in any case, it's different here, so they can choose a unequipped card from their current class. Basically, this means you can give the Spellweaver her other level 9 card, while other people aren't a fan of that. I definitely am, and I'm definitely also going to make another video post today about the level 9 Spellweaver with sort of a nuke focus rather than her traditional AoE spam non-loss build. So in any case, yeah, the bottom is extremely cool, especially for the Spellweaver due to her hand size of 8 by default. The top is interesting because it cycles burns, but I can't really think of a whole lot of situations where you'd want to use that. I mean, if your teammates have burns that they're using, and then you're like, okay, well now you just burn your other cards that you don't actually want so you can reburn those, and then you're burning 4 cards. I mean, on the plus side, it's a top non-loss. But if you want to have repeatable actions with Chimeric Formula, that doesn't actually seem too terribly useful, especially because you're basically saying, hey, you burned that card. What if I gave it back to you so you could maybe, burn it again? There's no net benefit to it, to my knowledge. That being said, if somebody fucks up on a short rest, for instance, then using Chimeric Formula could definitely save some hide, especially if it is something like, again, the Spellweaver's Reviving Ether. So interesting to note that this is a digital only thing at the moment, unless you want to like house rule it or you've been playing it wrong or whatnot. For any card that has a loss non-recoverable, so I can't hover over it while I'm over here, but oops. Any card that has a loss non-recoverable, let's see if there's others. I don't think so. I think it's just Stamina Booster, which we didn't choose. But in any case, so you see how it has the little card on fire symbol like that, so it's burned, and then they have another one which shows like a Fiery Pit. So that means it's non-recoverable if you lose it. In the board game, it's, once again, to my knowledge, if you lose it under any circumstance. So if you burn it from a rest, if you burn it to avoid damage, if you burn it because you use the bottom action in this case, or if you burn it because you use the top action, in all cases those cards are burned. You cannot, they're all those actions make the card unrecoverable, which is to say that if a card has unrecoverable on it anywhere, any way you lose it other than a discard is permanent / semi-permanent / for the rest of the scenario. In Gloomhaven Digital currently, this is supposedly a bug / unintended feature / something that they misinterpreted, but it's still supposedly, and I don't test it myself because I just don't put myself into situations where I lose unrecoverable cards by other sources or by accident. But in any case, it only is unrecoverable if the action that causes it to be unrecoverable plays. So in this case with Chimeric Formula, in Gloomhaven Digital, hypothetically, if I burned this for any other reason other than using the bottom, then if somebody used a card that let me get a burned card, I would get it back. So for instance, with the Chimeric Formula's top, if the Spellweaver burns her Reviving Ether card for any other reason than using the unrecoverable action, we could give it back to her if she messes up. That being said, again, it just seems smarter to not put yourself in this situation and to not bring, something that's just basically an oops undo button. That being said, if you're at high difficulties, maybe you'll find it more useful there, where, mistakes can be more severe. On the flip side, you'd hope people aren't making as severe mistakes at high level. And you're probably also going to require a lot more damage output rather than, unmaking others' mistakes. But a very interesting card overall if you're running a sustain build. It's basically like a why not. Or if you're just swooping up other people, again, it's sort of a why not. In our case, Lethal Injection is an interesting one. So as everybody and their mom points out, executes that are lost aren't as good as executes that are not lost, but we don't really have any other options, being the Tinkerer, other than, another loss, quote unquote execute. So just being able to delete any elite enemy is super cool in my eyes, because when you're looking at things like Elite Arcane Golem, or Elite, what are they called? Elite Stone Golems, Stone Giant, whatever, the big guys, any of the big guys, anything that has like 20 plus health and multiple shield and hits for like 4 or 5 damage around, those suck. And you know what doesn't suck? Being able to just literally delete them. So obviously the limitation is it's a burn, it's a top action, which means using the bottom in the meantime. It's only for one, and it doesn't apply to boss / special enemies, to which I reply with, yeah, but what else, what other card are we going to pick at this level? So yeah, the bottom move 4 is cool. Poison target all adjacent enemies, not as cool unless you're planning on setting up for Harsh Stimulants next round, which is also completely reasonable, since we picked that card otherwise. But in any case, it's just kind of a no-brainer. Just bring it. Why not? You could obviously look at getting rid of Disintegrating Beam at this point. Disintegration Beam, my apologies. Or you could look at getting rid of some of the ones that I mentioned earlier, which are a little bit more, I think, easy to rationalize getting rid of at this level. So you could even get rid of Enhancement Field, Tinkerer's Tools, for instance. Grab those two. So, on to items. Yeah, could talk... Enhancements are cool. I think items will be a little bit better to sort of rationalize why I still have some of these cards, which are otherwise not extremely useful at this level, without the items. And then we can sort of talk about enhancements after that, after sort of coming to the conclusion of why I have these cards selected. So yeah, we'll do that. We'll go with items first. All right, and of course this is going to have the caveat that I have a lot of stuff unlocked with the merchant, so if you don't want item spoilers, now is basically your last opportunity to leave. Okay, all right, cool. So we got a bunch of stuff, 215 items to be exact, although I believe that counts duplicates, i.e., 2 of these, and... Okay, scrolling was a bad idea. And like 8 potions, 4 potions. Right. Anyway, so I'm currently at also maxed reputation, so everything is $5 cheaper, so prices may vary. And of course, the items you have available at this point are also going to vary just based off of, what you get, what scenarios you complete, etc. So, talking about items from a level 1 perspective, we'll make this super easy to begin with. Eagle Eye Goggles and Piercing Bow. That's really all you care about. You can use some other things. You can choose to, as a Prosperity level 1, you can choose a Cloak of Invisibility, I guess, if you want. You can choose a Leather Armor if you want. You can bring boots of, here's the basic ones. Yeah, striding. You could bring the +2 move to a single movement. You could bring the jump, especially because we do lack a lot of jump, admittedly, in this deck. But yeah, the most important are Eagle Eye Goggles, because we're going to be using loss multi-target attacks, or at least I am, and I presume you'll try to if you're using this build. Yeah, like, there's not much more to say for the head action. Being able to attack with advantage is pretty neat, to say the least. Likewise, Piercing Bow, just being able to go through armor. Armor is great, because if we're attacking something with 2-3 armor, we now have, we use the Piercing Bow and we effectively double the attack value of our net shooter. Then we can also use advantage on it at the same time. So it's interesting to note, if you aren't already aware, because the Tinkerer has a massive hand size of 12, if we do long rest, it's not going to be extremely frequently. Even if we are using like 1-2 losses a rest cycle compared to our teammates. So it's very possible you'll only be using Eagle Eye Goggles a couple of times throughout the scenario. So that's why, again, I feel like it's super useful to use on those multi-target loss attacks, because you're only, again, going to be using these a couple of times, throughout the scenario. So if you're trying to use Eagle Eye Goggles every time you use Stun Shot or Toxic Bolt or something, I think you're going to have a bad time. But it is an option. Otherwise, if you are super high level and you want to do stuff and slap different gadgets on, I'm just going to say you're wrong, because looking at all these, there's literally nothing better than Eagle Eye Goggles for what we're looking at doing. So, at least what I'm looking at doing. For our chest items, once you get to the higher levels, you can do some more wonky stuff. So for instance, you could be using Sacrificial Robes. You take damage, you add damage to the attack action. I personally don't see the value in that. You could run Cloak of Invisibility if you want, being safe on a pocket option for just a one-time use. Blinking Cape, which is move 4 jump, which is pretty convenient. Cloak of Pockets if you're going to want to bring a bunch of items. Personally, I don't, but you could. I mean, any of the leather stuff, which doesn't give you negative item effects, since we don't have that option available on our deck as a Tinkerer. Personally, kind of a fan of Robes of Evocation, because we don't really use any elements for anything other than like Volatile Concoction, which we use for maybe 1 level. If there's just ambient, elements in the air, then it gives you +1 attack. It's again to the entire attack action. So anytime you're doing a multi-target attack, it gets buffed, which is pretty cool. It doesn't cost health. And again, we're probably only going to be, because it's a spent item, you're only going to be using it once per long rest anyway, unless you bring some specific small items. So I just, again, don't feel like it's a waste. That being said, Cloak of Pockets are pretty cool. Cloak of Phasing would be cool if you are running with a Craighart who can put down obstacles, because permanent flying is just cracked in and of itself. Or yeah, you could use Second Skin, which I believe is what I picked. Have to check the attack modifier deck afterwards. For boot items, if you have Boots of Levitation, which I don't, which give flying, then it's redundant if you have Cloak of Phasing. Otherwise, it's great. It's just basically permanent jump. So if you liked winged shoes, then you'll like always flying. That being said, if you feel like you need more movement, then obviously something like Rocket Boots or something like Serene Sandals are more useful. I believe we, even at this level, still have quite a few, move 1 move 4, 2 move 4, 3 move 4, 4 move 4. So having 1 and 3 cards being a move 4 bottom, although mind you, a lot of them are attached to loss top attacks. I don't feel like you needed additional movement a lot. Some other classes have like move 6 or 8s, and obviously we can't replicate that without using these items. But your mileage may vary. If you like really focusing on positioning, you can get text from Costco Instacart Shopper, or saying hi but not actually saying what the problem is. Lettuce. No, they're out of lettuce. Oh man, I probably should have. Probably should have done this video while I wasn't waiting for grocery delivery. That would have been smart. So maybe I'll just have to make another video even shortening this one. What a time to be alive. Okay, excellent. So talking about other items, yeah, I just went with Boots of Levitation. If you are, again, feeling like you're kind of falling behind, if you only really need the, you know, slight boost to move one time a rest cycle, etc., then, you know, bring one of those. Otherwise, if you like positioning, Magma Wages is cool, especially because it gives you some sustain via healing, especially since you're kind of skishy. Not really a whole lot more to say for options there. So hand items, which I've been putting off definitely on purpose, is because we get some really, really spicy options here. Weighted Net is not one of those spicy options, by the way. It's a bad card. Don't do that. So you have a couple of, you know, options for elements, but those are all lame and not in line with what we're doing. You have, again, some element creation, some element yoinking, shields, multi-target attack for weapons, etc., wound, poison, etc., whatever. We don't care about any of those, honestly, really, at all. If you want to be super cool and position things easier for your next attack, you could run Hooked Chain with something like Murderous Contraption Bottom. That being said, it's a spent item, and again, we have an enormous hand size, and it's using both hands, so suffice to say it's not terribly efficient for being, you know, in a slot. Shields are whatever, because we don't really want to be in melee range. And yeah, so that only leaves a few options, but boy, are they spicy indeed. So what I was talking about before with harsh stimulants, the reason why I chose it, the reason why I brought it, the reason why I liked it a lot when I was in the earlier prosperity, is because of Battle Axe. And that's because it's a single hand item, and it allows you to multi-target with it. So that turns a attack 9, suffer 2 damage. Maybe you know, want to use advantage, a minor power potion, major power potion, etc. Basically like an attack 10-ish generally before you pull modifiers, to take 2 damage into an attack 20, suffer 2 damage. I like that. I like that a lot. It's a lot of damage. It doesn't require a whole lot of investment. You don't even need to bother enhancing the shit out of this, which is good because it's expensive. So Battle Axe is very, 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 very cool for that. That being said, again, otherwise we're not really a melee build. Speaking of melee, interesting note, because Flamethrower is a melee action, it has you as a gray hex rather than just being a multi-red hex ranged action. You can actually use it with Warhammer and make it a stun. So that's cool because wound and stun have some natural synergy. You wound them, you stun them, they take a damage on their turn, they don't do anything else. The next turn they take another damage. So I don't know why you'd be in this situation, but if you are in melee range of multiple enemies with shield and you manage to act before them, which is even more unlikely, then you can wound stun them, and then that basically deals 2 damage over 2 turns where they aren't effectively able to do anything else unless they get healed. And those enemies tend to also not generally have a whole lot of heals. So that's pretty rad. You can also, of course, enhance this, but we'll get there when we get there. But again, Warhammer is a loss card, and it's a 2-handed one, so not a fan of that. Likewise, Piercing Bow, the reason why I don't suggest that at like the super high prosperity is because the next item we'll talk about, which is extremely spicy, and also because I don't feel like you're going to be in a whole lot of situations where wound doesn't do the job, or where you don't have teammates running Pierce that'll be more effective at it. So that being said, you could very well just take Piercing Bow all the way to level 9 if you really want to. So the absolutely phenomenal, beautiful thing that makes the Master Exploder so much better is Volatile Bomb and Unstable Explosives, because it takes a single target ranged attack and it does that to it. It makes it multi-target, and good God, do we love multi-target as the Grenadier Tinkerer, okay? So when I was talking about the Battle Axe before, the Volatile Bomb, it's because I did not have the better version of Volatile Bomb unlocked, which is Unstable Explosives. So these are both single-hand items. So once I unlocked Unstable Explosives, I knew we were in for a good time, because you can buy and you can equip both of those bad boys, okay? So you can't equip double of like anything, but you can equip one of each of those. And that is so good, because it means that you can turn Toxic Bolt's bottom into an attack 3 or attack 4, and you can also use the other one to turn Crankbow into an attack 3 or attack 4. And again, that's great. You're taking a attack 5, turning it into 15 or 20. You're taking an attack 6, and you're turning it into 18 to 24 before cards, before modifiers. It's great. It's like the reason I picked Crankbow is because I can turn it into a multi-target attack that's more damaging than any of my other ranged attacks with the Tinkerer. It's just great. It's honestly, if you're doing this build, these are the items to take. For your hands, I literally I can't rationalize using anything else other than maybe if you don't want to bring Crankbow or Toxic Bolt, or if you don't feel like you need multi-target on each of them, in which case I'd suggest bringing the Battle Axe just for harsh stimulants. But yeah, like the entire point of the build is blow up a bunch of shit. This helps you blow up a bunch of shit. I don't see a reason why you wouldn't take it. So that kind of covers all of these slots. We'll talk about the beg items. So basically whatever floats you out. Honestly, it's really just that easy. If you want to be super crazy, you start earring, refresh all of those spent items we were talking about. Cry because your hand items are not spent, they're consumed. Maybe you want to bring, more sustain to your party with the scrolls. Maybe you want to bring more damage with power potions. You got a whole bunch of options. You can disarm traps, you can stack damage on people. Maybe you want to be in melee range after all, so you use, maybe you use lethal injection, walk up, poison everybody, use black sensor and muddle them all, and then you stun one of them, and the next round you use harsh stimulants with the battle axe. I don't know, like pretty much any of these are good with the build. Like just going through it, like black card, yes, we're going to be within melee range for harsh stimulants. Black sensor, yes, we're going to be within melee range or at least close to multiple people. Yes, dealing with traps are cool. Yes, stun, poisoning, and cursing is cool. This is probably one of the lesser reasonable things to bring, but it's an option if you really want to stack on the CC, especially with something like Net Shooter, just to be a bully. Doom Compass, yes, reposition things so they fit better in your multi-target hexes. Don't summon, don't do that, don't loot either. Helix Reaming isn't really particularly useful because we don't actually have 25 health. Strengthening allies, if you're running a support build, not particularly useful here. Potions, again, mana potions, completely useless for this build / character in general. You can bring it for your friendlies though if you want to be hero. Healing potions, especially the superior healing potion, is like half your health bar even at high levels, so that's cool to bring. That being said, you're going to want to make sure you're not poisoned at that point, because using a superior healing potion is definitely something that my group has done before, and yes, it feels bad. Power potion should be an obvious choice, especially the major one. You can bring the major and the minor if you want, just due to how many bag slots you have, especially if you bring Cloak of Pockets. Stamina potions are just they're just best in slots, so definitely bring those. Again, Moon Earring with refreshing spent items, not particularly useful in my eyes. You can bring Power Core, it's a better summon than Ring of Skulls or Jade Falcon, but again, I wouldn't bring either of them for this build specifically. And then any of the items that give additional turns, so Second Chance Ring or Ring of Brutality, Ring of Haste, are also pretty spicy, especially because again, you have the ability to use something like Hook Gun and pull enemies in a formation and then blast them with something like Net Shooter. So yeah, like I said, you can't really go wrong with selecting items. Like I said, you have a myriad of options available, especially at this level, for supporting teammates or supporting yourself or buffing yourself or, sustaining yourself, etc., etc. In any case, I'd probably recommend doing the major power potion, the minor power potion, the major stamina potion, the minor stamina potion, and then if you want to, splurge, start your ring or Second Chance Ring, just because, one of these last two give you a lot more situational control. And we're going to be using a lot of lost cards, so getting recovery is not a bad thing either. Cool, so on to enhancements. Now that I have outlined why we are you know, bringing the potentially melee item if you did bring the battle axe, or otherwise these babies for the crankbow, toxic bolt. Right, so yeah, if you have max prosperity again, you also have max enhancement points, enchantments, whatever, which is to say you can enhance 9 cards. I would not enhance cards you aren't bringing, so it seems like a pretty easy thing where it's like, okay, well, I have 12 cards and I can enhance 9 of them, so I'll just go to town on you know, the 9 more important ones and ignore the non-important ones. So speaking about like just going top bottom on ones that are like what you could choose for each card. Flamethrower, add hexes, yeah, why not? This is just going to assume that you have infinite money and not like prioritize anything in particular. I didn't bother enhancing any of these in the board game version, just because money, especially because we have a, you know, a deck that's really heavy on the higher level cards. Like, you know, enhancing any of these lower level ones is probably less important, other than maybe I'd say Ink Bomb, but because it's a multi-target, it's also still pretty expensive. But in any case, so just going top down for these cards that I have selected, at least, things that'd be cool to bring. So hexes, why not? For the attack 3, because it has wound, like I said earlier, it synergizes with stun, so you could bring the poor man's stun, which is disarm. Maybe you want to immobilize them instead, you know, whatever sparks joy. In any case, I think disarm would probably be the best bet. You could bring a plus attack to turn into an attack 3 into attack 4, but again, flamethrower cards specifically I think is more so for the wound than the damage function on it. For the bottom, you can strengthen or bless or put an element, but again, unless you're specifically buffing teammates, I won't worry about it. Because of how rare you're using this card, especially for the bottom, I don't think the plus shield is a bad call, so that you actually, if you need a shield, you have a very beefy shield. That being said, if you want to get more distance out of this, then you can, you know, strengthen yourself, which is again great for being able to use our loss multi-target attack tops, or maybe you want to bless if you have a, you know, if your teammates are running summons or if your teammates are going to huddle close to you. Strength is probably the best in slot just for the ability to affect self as a non-loss. Bottom strengthens are pretty crazy, but again, you know, your mileage may vary. You may not even have flamethrower for this, so depending on who you are. So hook gun is pretty straightforward and extremely cheap enhancements. Like you can literally grab that and then the other one at you know, at level 9 if you just like start in. But again, I wouldn't worry about enhancing this one too much. I feel like it's fine as is for an attack range 3 because that's the range of most of our attacks anyway, and that should be a distance we're comfortable at being at. But if you do enhance range, you really want to enhance the pull as well, so that you can still get the full pull for, well, pulling them from whatever the range is by default. So 3, pull the 2, which puts them in melee range. But if you want to have a range 4, then I'd still suggest definitely get that pull upgrade as well to get them once again within melee range. That being said, maybe you don't want this card at high level. So Ink Bomb, I think, is probably the easiest one to rationalize as enhancing because it is our strongest loss attack for a while that multi-targets by default until you get prosperity, I think 3, which gives volatile bomb for toxic bolt. So I just straight up plus attack this because, I mean, it's our strongest non-loss card. You could add plus move. I'd probably suggest jump in this case just because we, again, don't have a whole lot of jump in this deck to begin with. But I mean, you could even kick up elements in the air for your teammates if you really want. Net shooter. I, again, don't really focus on melee too much. If you wanted to follow up, like I said, by doing lethal injection and then stun or something for your top action on one turn, and then harsh stimulants enemy and then running away, net shooter could be cool in that regard. But, you know, again, it's... I'm not in a whole lot of situations where I actually use the bomb for anything. I'm much more likely to just use it for a move 2, in which case I want to enhance it, make it a move 3, because otherwise what's the point in not just using the default action? Having a move 2 jump is extremely situational. I can't even think of a situation where that would have been any good. So that's kind of a easier enhancement to pull. You could always, of course, enhance the top because it is rather cheap, being a plus hex on a level 1 card that already has multiple hexes. For the immobilize, I've never actually thought about this on what you'd want to do with it. I mean, disarm is kind of irrelevant unless it's a ranged enemy, in which case immobilizing them doesn't really do anything. At least it's not any benefit over just like muddling them. guess maybe poison. If you're wanting to immobilize someone, it's generally because they're dealing damage, quite a bit of damage, and are rather slow, or have low movement to begin with. So being able to immobilize them and then poison them gives your team quite a few options for, of course, getting the extra kill on it. Stun shot, wound, because of the synergy with stun. Yeah, I mean, you could run other things. I wouldn't really bother turning an attack 1 into an attack 2. Range is whatever, like a why not sort of thing if you're still bringing the card. And obviously for move bottom again, you just jump is probably preferable. Toxic Bolt, range, again, kind of irrelevant. I don't feel like you really need to bother enhancing your entire deck to be a range 4, because I feel like range 3 is still like enough range from things without being in a lot of danger. But that being said, it's the only, you know, available one for this slot, and you can enhance the same card as many times as you want without taking up an additional enchantment point. So if you have the money, why not? Bottom attack, yeah, just add an attack, why not? Again, we're kind of using this as one of our nuke cards. I don't see a reason to worry about buffing stuff for damage, or sorry, for crowd control. And then likewise, it's also kind of a no-brainer to add range to this, especially because it is a level 1 lost bottom high damage attack. The enhancement is extremely cheap since it's single target, and again, range 3 is just a lot more comfortable than range 2. So, you know, for 30 gold, I think it's worth the flexibility, even if you are a low level. Crankbow, just attack, just absolutely stack a disgusting amount of damage on this bad boy. Is basically where I'm coming from it. Like anything as far as poison or wound or immobilizing or disarm or whatnot, like really, like I feel like you're better off slapping those on other cards. Like you could even do it with, you know, stun shotting and then crankbowing the next round. I really don't feel like adding CC to this is useful, because the entire point of it is you're trying to kill multiple things at once, and you really want to capitalize on having high damage in order to do that, especially because it is a lost card. In my opinion, a move, again, I'd probably just jump, but you could add more move if you want. Noxious Vials is kind of a more interesting one. You do still have the same shape as Net Shooter, so you have the ability to turn it from 3 hex into 4 hex. Not really a whole lot of situations where there's 4 enemies in this specific shape, but having the additional pip gives you a little bit more flexibility if the enemies are sort of in like a, you know, I don't know what you even call this, a parentheses, a curve line, rather than in the triangle character V formation. It's just sort of a flexibility thing rather than like being able to attack multiple targets. I probably should have opened with this, but my philosophy for using any of these loss is I really want to avoid using them if I can't hit at least 2 enemies, and because of the ability to use positioning, traps, pull, etc., it's almost always 3 enemies. Adding another hex sort of makes it easier to hit at least 3 of those, but then of course you might want to try and save for those situations where you can get 4. I don't know, it's you know, kind of your call. If you don't think you're going to get greedy and try and like waste turns to try and get 4 enemies at once, then I think just adding the hexes is a no-brainer. Again, it's the only option for that, so why not, sort of thing. For damage, because this is a CC card specifically, I think it's probably a bit more reasonable to add something like wound or immobilize or disarm. Immobilize is probably preferable in this case, because you're able to prevent the enemies from moving and then follow up with additional damage due to poison. If you're doing an attack next round, that being said, I can't foresee a whole lot of situations where you'd want to do this as a bottom and then a loss attack next round, instead of just using this as the bottom and then a loss attack on the same round, other than maybe initiative concerns, which again, I think that's kind of what Net Shooter is good for. Because again, you could run Noxious Vials with poison, say disarm, and then run Net Shooter with immobilize, and basically the thing is CC to hell. You've done multiple attacks potentially against multiple targets, and then they can take additional damage with poison, then damage over time with wound, for instance. You could also just straight up buff the damage, but I'm not too concerned about adding just 1 damage to any of the attack 3s. Once again, I'm mostly focused on turning the attack 4 pluses into even more damaging pieces, and I feel like the attack 3s are more so just for the crowd control function. Disintegration Beam, pretty straightforward. Add a hex, why not? It's just, I mean, how frequently are you going to get 4 enemies in a line that all have less than 5 health? Pretty rare. How frequently are you going to get more than, you know, 2 enemies in a straight line? Pretty frequently. So adding an extra hex is sort of just like Net Shooter and Noxious Files, I think, where it just gives you additional flexibility for hitting additional people, even if you aren't filling all of those hexes. For the bottom, if we're going to use the Poor Man's Stun, we may as well use the wound as well. And then, of course, you have the move. And because it's attached to the same action, if you're going to have a move 2, you may as well turn it into a move 3, in my opinion. British Contraption, I don't care about any of these tops. Maybe you do, but they're, as you can see, pretty expensive, and they're only, like, minorly increasing the sustainability of the bot, in my opinion. That being said, like, an attack 4 is pretty spicy if you have somebody who's more summon focused and can actually keep the kill bot alive, or juggle aggro, or you have a frontline tank or something. But in my case, again, I just didn't bother with it. As a repeatable bottom action, a plus attack is probably the easiest one to add, because again, returning attack 4 into attack 5, especially because it's a bottom, we're able to attack multiple things per round, or the same thing for a lot of damage. You can of course add range as well, but I mean, again, conversation of 3 versus 4. So Harsh Stimulants, if you are going to bring this card, I don't see any reason why not to use the plus attacks on them. That being said, of course, it's going to get like ridiculously expensive, especially with the multi-enhancement cost, and it's high level. But again, if you're bringing Harsh Stimulants, it's because you absolutely want to like banish something to the Shadow Realm. May as well turn it into an attack 11 before modifiers. Yeah, then Lethal Injection is pretty straightforward. Add a additional move if you want, add a jump, which is what I'd prefer. Or just don't bother about enhancing it, because it's enhancing, you know, it's using one of your enhancement slots for something that only has 1 pip, as opposed to one of these other ones that has 3 or more, which are a little bit more useful. So yeah, I think that covers enhancements okay. So last thing I talked about is attack modifier deck, which you can absolutely have more perks than available slots. So obviously you can see, and I probably should have talked about this immediately after cards, or maybe even before, but you can see we do have a few CC options. We have a few options for healing as well. And we have the very spicy add target card, which never seems to bother wanting to come up when I need it. But in any case, probably first thing to do is shift the attack modifier deck from a low damage one into a mid-high damage one. So getting rid of our negatives is probably the best way to do that. Because we still have a single -1 card available, you could run Second Skin as a body part. It does get rid of 2 -1s in your attack modifier deck. That being said, it gets rid of 2. You only have 1, and you can't even like have only 2 in your deck. It's either 3 or 1. So that's kind of why I feel like Robes of Evocation are a little bit more useful. But meh. You do you, I guess. If you really want to get rid of all your negatives other than nulls, then you can. So once we get rid of all the negatives, it's actually a pretty spicy deck just to begin with. And then it just gets better from there. So we can shift it some more depending on how frequently you're upgrading your range on your attacks. You might find that adding the add target earlier rather than adding damage is better. Again, if you're a comfortable range of 3, having 4 is just nice for being able to potentially snag another person in the background. I am also a fan of the Ignore Scenario effects. That's actually probably the first one you'd want to get, because getting cursed or muddled or poisoned or whatever, taking damage sucks. And then you have the CC ones and the heals. So the heals aren't too terribly important in and of themselves, but it is a +1 anyway, so kind of a why not. I'd probably prefer focusing on the wounds, because they are effectively a +2 damage due to them taking the wound on their turn, almost guaranteed. Again, like unless something heals between their turn and you attacking, which you can probably control pretty easily, then it's just basically an attack 2+, because obviously it can affect them over multiple turns. Immobilize is cool, especially with our multi-target for preventing them from breaking formation for the next round. And then, like I said, the heals, it's just kind of a why not. It's just more +1s, less likely to pull the -1 and the null, and you heal. That being said, you could definitely make the argument that you don't really want to bring the heal cards, because you don't want to dilute the deck with more 1s than the +3 2 times and attack modifier, or additional attack modifier. But you know, your mileage will vary, sort of thing. I feel like having the heals are cool, just sort of from a sustained perspective. That being said, you are a ranged attack. You aren't going to be running into them very frequently. So you could get rid of the +1 to heals, you could get rid of the additional +1s. I definitely recommend still holding on to the +3 and the add target and the wound. The immobilize is sort of a maybe debatable thing. Personally, I don't particularly care for just infused fire because it doesn't affect us in any way, shape, or form, and it's a rolling modifier, which means, and this has been something that's been discussed at length, but long story short, if you attack with advantage and you get a rolling modifier and then a null, the null still applies while you get no effect off the rolling modifier, which is to say that rolling modifiers with advantage, if you pull a null, completely suck. If you are not in those situations, if you're not attacking with advantage, it doesn't really matter because pulling a rolling and then a null is the same as just having pulled the null when it was, just a regular pull in a non-advantage situation. And likewise, just a rolling muddle, I don't find too terribly interesting because we are going to be wanting to attack in advantage a lot for the build. I personally just don't see the point in bringing the rolling modifiers because you run the risk of rolling into a null rather than pulling a null and literally anything else, which would be a lot more useful for, the sake of it being a multi-target attack. So, I think that probably covers everything. I guess I could talk a little bit about synergies, but I have a feeling like you can just kind of sort of come to your own conclusions with these. Because we're not focused on running like a trap build, it's not going to be as good with Craigart's obstacling as like maybe a more dedicated trap build, but you could make a hybrid build pretty easily because we do already have Tinkerer's tools as well as proximity mine and volatile concoction to begin with. Maybe you wanted to choose the gas canister instead. Anybody who needs a lot of healing is just going to suck. It's not really the purpose of this. This is basically turning the Tinkerer into a sort of pseudo spellweaver. So you're not really running support very much. So if you have any frontline tanks, you do want them to be self-sustaining, or you want them to be covered by another healer in the group. That being said, as has been discussed by many people, the best status effect to apply to enemies is generally just death. So, if everything's dead, you don't need heals. Out of the starting 6, I think probably, I just love the Craighart for the environmental control. I think Craighart and Tinkerer would probably still make a rather powerful combo, even if you don't spec specifically into traps, because the Craighart can help group up enemies into formation, most notably for Disintegration Beam, because they can make a single line path towards you. Again, you aren't explicitly a melee character either, though, so having somebody else who can tank hits like a melee Craighart or a Brute is useful. Obviously, there's a bunch of spoiler classes as well that you can use for synergizing, but again, basically, if you just look at this sort of as a pseudo spellweaver with a bit less sustain for themselves and a bit more sustain for the group, I think that's probably the best way to look at this build. So that will, I think, conclude the stream. We'll have to add in the timestamps I missed, and then can post. Hopefully this is a somewhat useful resource for people. I know that there was a at least one poster when I mentioned this build asking about image by image or a written out guide. While I don't particularly care to write out an hour and 8 minutes worth of me talking, I could very easily just do an image by image or even just take screenshots of the selections at each level. So I'll probably do that and be posting that to the subreddit for Gloomhaven as well later today.